I think, Jim, you're exactly right. Of course, the U.S. could, if it wanted to, quote, lead by actually doing something constructive rather than totally defensive in using the veto. What's happening in the UN, of course, is nearly complete isolation of the US and Israel vis-a-vis the rest of the world. In the Security Council, with the 15 votes, the most recent call for a ceasefire went 13 to 1 to 1. So 13 members voted for a ceasefire. The United States vetoed that call, and the UK, ever loyal, abstained. And by the way, abstained even though the public pressures in the UK to stop this massacre are actually quite strong on the streets, with mass demonstrations taking place regularly in London. Then the vote went to the UN General Assembly under a doctrine that when there is a paralysis in the Security Council, it can be taken up by the UN General Assembly in a operational move that Dean Acheson actually established a little over 70 years ago, called Uniting for Peace. So it went to the UN General Assembly, and there the vote was 153 calling for an immediate ceasefire, 10 opposed, the United States, Israel, and 8 small countries, and 23 abstaining, with 7 very small countries not voting for one reason or another. Maybe their representative wasn't actually in New York or something like that. So the vote was 153 yes, 10 opposed, and 23 abstaining. If you calculate the populations in each of those categories, turns out that in the 153 governments that voted for the immediate ceasefire, that's 89% of the world's population in the countries of those 153 votes. The countries in the no vote, the US category, is 5% of the world population, of which the US is 4%, and the other 9 countries, Israel, Guatemala, Paraguay, and some really small islands, that turns out to be 5% total, and we're 4% of that. So the countries that joined the US on the vote constitute 1% of the world population. Then the abstentions is another 5% of the world population in those 23 countries. And then the 7 not voting is a little under 1%. So you get 100%. And my point is, just to finish the point, the U.S. is essentially isolated now. That isolation is going to actually intensify in the coming weeks. The U.S. is basically, Israel always says, we don't care. You're all a bunch of anti-Semites or whatever they claim. But the United States does care. To be completely alone in the world, other than with Israel, really hurts American interests all over the world. And that's what's actually happening right now. So my view is this pressure is going to continue to intensify. We're seeing a mass slaughter every day. And the vote isn't going to be 153 next time. It's going to be 165 next time, or 170, because we see even the likes of the UK, France, Germany saying we need a ceasefire now because they're hearing it from their own publics. So the United States is basically standing alone next to Israel, and that's it.
Dr. Sachs, why hasn't there any effective carrot and stick policy with Israel? Like, we've only seen reward after reward, but we haven't seen.
Yes, there is no stick because the American politicians want to show that they're on the side of Israel. That's been their traditional modus operandi. And this is the main point. They're starting to realize it doesn't work. doesn't work for geopolitics. It doesn't work for their own vote. It doesn't work for the public. So I think that there is some worry, because also what's happening, what we see on the videos, what we see in the television every day is beyond shocking. It's mass murder of a civilian population in broad, clear daylight. No murmur of attempt at diplomacy by Israel. Quite the contrary, a complete denial of any intention of Palestinian rights now or after the fighting. Quite the contrary, Netanyahu came out and said, well, Oslo process, that was a mistake. We will never allow the Palestinian Authority to have control over Gaza. We will keep control over Gaza. In other words, it's vulgar. And it is a war for Israel to have full control over everything. And if that means mass slaughter and ethnic cleansing, Israel will go ahead. The question is, will the United States provide the munitions each day for this? And as I say, the training of these politicians is, yes, don't show space with Israel. That's been the way for decades. The vulgarity of this and the criminality of it and the fact that it doesn't play with the public and the isolation of the United States in the world will force a re-examination of these basic precepts. And how fast or not that will happen is exactly what we're seeing right now. I'm trying to do anything I can to see more votes that show the U.S. isolation, that draw clearly that this is the whole world speaking out for justice and for stopping of the war. The American politicians, they have a high tolerance for people being killed. They've been killing people for a long, long time, but not in such a vivid way on the screen, so clear every day.
There is one point, but I'll come back and just sure. As a follow-up to this. There is one point that I don't think may, or I don't know if it's being made enough. I'd love to get your take on it. But one of the biggest arguments that Israel has in the, to the international community, its right to defend itself, and I get that point. But in looking at some of the numbers that came out of the 2006 war in Lebanon and the crucial role that the UN played through resolution number 1701, highlights a couple of really interesting points. One, between the year 1982 and 2000, when Israel was occupying the south of Lebanon, there were about, I think, 12 to 1,300 soldiers, Israeli soldiers, that were killed. From 2000 to 2022, 23, that number went down by about 97.5%. to I think 28, if you put aside the 2006 war. 2006 war essentially was a war for the release of Lebanese prisoners. They took the two soldiers. And ultimately, even though the war ended up doing a lot of destruction and death as usual, the prisoners were exchanged, and all of the Lebanese prisoners were released from Israeli prisons. Now, interestingly, the lesson from that war is between 2006 and 2023, the border has been, I'd say, relatively quiet. Some flare-ups here and there, but nothing major. They even signed an oil and gas deal just last year. One of the points that I think is missing, and I'd love to get your take on it, is if the Land for Peace model were to be reconsidered, there is a proof point that it works, and it still works. It worked in Egypt, it worked in Jordan, it worked in Lebanon, and it reduced from the amount of Israeli deaths, as proven by a 97.5% drop in the amount of dead Israeli soldiers. I'd love to get your take on this and the important role that the UN, through 1701 and so many other resolutions, played in making it happen, and whether there is such an opening now, notwithstanding the U.S. reticence to actually, to go for it along UN lines.
Well, you make a very good point, and it is, of course, my own position that we should move immediately to the two-state outcome. My own proposal is that the UN Security Council should immediately vote Palestine as the 194th UN member state. It could do that in principle next week, because Palestine made its application in September 2011. It's been pending for a dozen years. The first application was blocked by the United States. Palestine accepted observer status under U.S. pressure. But now I think under the current realities, the Security Council should try, and probably the U.S. would veto it, but I would try anyway, for an immediate recognition of Palestine as the 194th UN member state based on the borders of the 4th of June, 1967, as called for by all relevant UN Security Council resolutions going back to 242 and 338 and many, many others since then. So this is what I would recommend, and I do think that it could lead to peace. And of course, the fact is that the Arab Peace Initiative, which was first launched in 2002, is exactly predicated on this. The Arab states have said repeatedly, we will normalize relations with Israel, we will make peace with Israel, based on a two-state solution on the 4 June 1967 borders. And when the Arab and Islamic leaders met in Riyadh about a month ago now and issued the declaration, they cited the Arab Peace Initiative of 2002, which has been repeated many times since then, and they reiterated in their own words. And importantly, that included Iran as well as the Arab countries, that peace is possible. There needs to be an immediate end to the fighting, and there needs to be a state of Palestine, sovereign and with the borders of June 4, 1967. So this, to my mind, is the right approach. Now, why isn't it happening? Well, it's not happening precisely because this government in Israel, and arguably just about every government of the last 50 years, isn't really interested in that kind of peace. They're not really looking fundamentally for that kind of security in which they have a normalization of relations with Arab countries based on two states. They're really looking for one state. They're really looking for one state, that is Israel, which, as they say, using biblical terms, includes not only present-day Israel, but also Judea and Samaria, meaning the West Bank, and Gaza. And so that's what this is about. Of course, what's happened in Israel over the last 50 years is that it's become more and more and more right-wing and extreme nationalist. And the Netanyahu government is an extremist government by any account. It's not even close. There's nobody in the government that talks about two states. Quite the contrary. Netanyahu said very explicitly, no way to two states. And some of the senior cabinet ministers, like the finance minister Smotrich, he calls himself a fascist, by the way. Maybe in a jocular way, but he says fascist. Yeah, sure. And his party is the party for so-called Greater Israel. What does Greater Israel mean? It means that Israel will control all of the territory of Palestine and present-day Israel. So this is very deep politically. You have Gallant, the finance minister. You have Ben-Gvir. You have Smotrich. You have Netanyahu. These are the leaders. They're not fighting a war for Hamas. They are fighting a war for Israel to have full control over Gaza and the West Bank. And that's why they're not saying, well, if Hamas would somehow be defeated, we'd go to a two-state solution. Exactly the opposite. And this makes what they're doing not only war crimes per se, but
nonsensical.
All the more vile. There's no endpoint to it. It's pure war, pure ethnic cleansing, and that is their vision. The answer is quite simple. The United States does not want to stop the wars. In fact, the United States is the enabler of so many wars around the world. It's really tragic. When it comes to the war in Gaza right now, if the United States stopped providing munitions to Israel, the war would end in a day. This war literally continues only because Israel gets munitions from the United States. It's not even out of stockpiles. It's out of new deliveries all the time. So if the United States took the choice, perforce, the fighting would stop. Of course, if the United States took political decisions, not vetoing UN Security Council resolutions, abiding by UN Security Council resolutions calling for a two-state solution, I think that on political grounds, the war in Gaza could end essentially immediately. I talked about other wars, just to mention them quickly. The war in Syria, which has gone on since 2011, is a U.S. regime change operation gone wrong, as most of them do, in a very deep way. It was decided by the U.S. and some of the regional partners that they would bring down Bashar al-Assad. And President Obama gave a famous finding, the Timber Sycamore operation of the CIA to bring down Assad. It failed, but it has caused 12 years of nonstop war. And I know through my work in the UN that war could have ended in 2012, but the US blocked the solution to the war. There was an agreement to end the war, but the United States said, no, Assad must go or the war continues. Similarly, I talked about the Ukraine war. This is a completely misunderstood war because of the U.S. narrative, which is false. This is a war caused by the U.S. Overthrow of the Ukrainian government in February 2014, followed by, and for the purpose of, and followed by an attempt until today to extend NATO to the border of Russia. And Russia, understandably, in my view, completely understandably, would not have it. And so this is a war over NATO enlargement. If the United States said any moment, NATO will not expand to Ukraine and to Georgia, by the way, which was put as a pair with Ukraine, the war would end. In fact, it almost did end in April 2022, weeks after the start of Russia's special military operation, because that whole invasion in February 2022 was designed not to take over the country, but to force Ukraine to the negotiating table, which it did. Zelensky and the Ukrainian government negotiated a peace with Russia based on neutrality, and the United States stepped in and said, no way, you're signing that. And the war has continued since then. So these are wars of choice. They are wars, in my view, of an American empire, a very misguided one. I'm an American. This is a government that is not serving my purposes at all. It's wasting my money and it's killing a lot of people. So I find it all disgusting. I can tell you, and I don't mean to sound absurdly personal about it, but no government's ever asked me about this in the sense that these issues are not publicly debated in the United States. The causes of the wars are hidden from view. The narratives officially are lies. The votes on funding the wars are pushed through Congress almost without public debate. And so public opinion plays almost no role. So this is another sad part of this. But the long answer to your short question is these are wars of choice that the United States could stop immediately, but for various political and geopolitical reasons, chooses not to stop at the great cost for humanity and at the great cost for risks of further escalation.
So I'd like to pick up on the cost side of things. Clearly, you know, the United States has had to pay a hefty price tag in most of its wars, to the tune of trillions, in Afghanistan and in Iraq, etc. And you know, at home, there's a lot of political pressures that are being exerted. Now, specifically as it pertains to the Israeli-Gaza war, these pressures have really flooded into the streets, maybe not to that degree with respect to the Ukraine or some of the other wars, but with the Israeli-Gaza war, I mean, we've seen, you know, manifestations in LA, in New York, you know, even from all sorts of communities, Palestinian, even Jewish communities, all kinds of communities. And some of them are basically starting to question verbally, like never before, these kinds of policies that the U.S. administration, you know, is undertaking. I think even the State Department has had some may I call it clandestine, because they had their faces covered in front of the White House manifestations so that they're not under any risk, but kind of to also object to the current policies of the United States. Would you be able to kind of shed a little bit to, you know, your opinion on how much that's playing a part in what appears to be a shift in U.S. policy from October 7th to today? And is that trend going to continue going forward in your opinion? Or is there something that's going to hamper it and not allow it to go any further?
So I think there are two parts to the question, if I might. First is a bit about the costs financially, and then the costs politically. The costs financially of the U.S. wars of choice in the 21st century really dated to 9/11, if we might, Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Ukraine, and many other smaller wars as well, come to, according to different estimates, somewhere between $5 and $8 trillion. Even for a macroeconomist like myself, that's not small change. This is 25% or 33% from a quarter to a third of the U.S. annual output. Now, the reason that these wars have been able to be prosecuted at such cost and with no positive results for America or for the world is that they've been run on credit. If an American president said, "We want to fight the war, we're going to raise your taxes to do it," the wars would end in one moment. So these are wars that are fought on deficit finance. The debt has been rising. The U.S. debt, public debt, that is, the debt owed by the Treasury, measured as a share of our U.S. national income, has increased from about 35% of our national income to about 100% of our national income between the year 2000 and today. This is a huge increase of debt, but it is not noticed up front because it is adding to the tab that's coming due. It's not an immediate burden. And similarly, of course, if there was even a breath of anything like a draft of actually Americans serving in any of these wars by a draft, they would also end in a moment, because the public doesn't support any of this. But these are wars that presidents are able to carry out essentially on their own personal authority, with a bit financed by Congress. Why? Because it's not noticed by the American people, and it's very popular with the military-industrial complex. After all, these wars are big business. This is no question part of the story. You have Boeing, you have Lockheed Martin, you have Northrop Grumman, you have General Dynamics, you have Raytheon, 5 big companies that have hundreds of billions of dollars of arms contracts. And they spread that back to Congress, especially to the Armed Services Committee. So we have a can I say, a shitstorm in our politics, because it's so corrupt now. And even, I shouldn't say even, Biden, who is not a very impressive politician to say the least, in trying to make the case for aid, actually doesn't make the case in terms of ethics, morality, safety, security, but he shows where the weapons are being produced and where the jobs are in the different congressional districts. So it's pretty crude stuff. Now, again, the American people would not tolerate any direct burden of this. So all of this is done on the side. Most people don't follow and don't really feel the budget deficits, except recently in the last couple of years, interest rates have gone up a lot. U.S. credit ratings have come down. House prices, mortgage costs are going up. So people are starting to also even make that financial link, even though all of this is debt financed. They're saying, you know, I'm feeling the pain from this. And of course, if they factor in the trillions of debt that is going to have to be paid in the future by taxes or by inflation, they would feel it even more. But this is starting to be felt, and it's one of the reasons why Congress pushed back in recent months, not just what they would normally do of signing the bill, but a lot of congressmen saying the price is too high, even in a financial sense. Now, when you come to the political ramifications, which you asked about, this is absolutely fascinating, because the assumption of American politics for the last 50 years has been that it is always right for any politician to hone completely to Israel's point of view, because you have the Israel lobby, you have AIPAC, you have campaign contributions, you have not only Jewish voters, but you have Christian fundamentalist voters who, for their own theological reason, are even sometimes more strongly pro-Israel, quote unquote, if only to accelerate the Armageddon, by the way. But they're more pro-Israel in their voting than even the Jews sometimes. But the point is, the assumption of American politics, the training of politicians, is never show any space with Israel. And Biden, who's an old man and operates, I'd say, about 30 years out of date, and has a training that reflects the 1990s. This is his position, which is standing up for Israel no matter what. And so that's the normal politics. What has been the huge surprise for these politicians, I think a shock actually, is that young people aren't buying into it. So we have a tremendous generational change. It's not a change across the board in public opinion. It's really the under 35s primarily, our students on the campuses. Our students are looking at mass murder and saying, what the hell is this? Why are we complicit in this? And when they then protest, the donors to the university and the congressmen go crazy. You know, How dare the student say something against Israel? And it's been a huge shock to the older powers that be in the United States that this doesn't play. And Biden is finding he's losing support, a lot of support right now, by virtue of this knee-jerk, unconditional support for Israel, which has always been the formula for a Biden-like politician. It doesn't work anymore. This generational change is a very deep one. It's not going to go away. There's very little sympathy among younger people, and that's both Jews and non-Jews, by the way, though, of course, the proportions will vary in different groups. But a lot of young Jews are incredibly unhappy about what Israel is doing. And our student bodies more generally on the campuses are really unhappy. And the campuses are the administrators and the donors who have always been like the U.S. politicians, 100% pro-Israel, unquestioned, are extremely surprised at what's happening right now.
What would be the challenges?
The U.S. Did aim to build a global world, a globally interconnected world, but on the presumption that the U.S. would always be at the center of it and the dominant power of it. But it meant that the U.S. was ready at a lot of times to take some responsibility and to pay some costs and to take some what was true leadership, open the markets for other countries before those other countries would open the markets to U.S. goods, or actively share technologies, or inventing foreign aid, which was an anti-Soviet move, but it was real money given to other countries, which is not a usual behavior in the world. And the U.S. had the concept of so-called trade rounds to reduce trade barriers, and then eventually to create WTO, which was a U.S. initiative, and so on. Now, the presumption of all of this was that an interconnected world would be good, and the U.S. would sit on top of it. I won't say it's a miscalculation, I would say the naivete of that view was, yeah, other countries are going to come along, and the U.S. being 4.1% of the world population has no right to presume that it is the hegemon that gets to determine everything else. And lo and behold comes China with a population 4 times larger, more than 4 times larger, and extraordinarily skillful governance and really remarkable quality of planning and governance and good judgment with the reforms ushered in by Deng Xiaoping starting in 1978. The U.S. didn't see it coming, but China grew at around 10% per year. That means you double every 7 years in aggregate size of the economy. That's fast. You do that for 35 years, that's 5 doublings. That's 2 times 2 times 2 times 2 times 2. That's 32-time increase of the size of the economy. That's what China achieved. Suddenly, China's bigger than the United States, again, measured in international prices. Now, this is an incredible affront to the Americans. Not to me. I think it's great. You know, China is catching up. That's wonderful. That's what economics is supposed to be all about. Is it a loss for the United States? Not in any real way at all. None of China's gains is a loss for the United States. None of it. It just expands world markets. We have more productivity. We have new technology. We're able to buy a lot of goods and my iPhone made in China and so forth at low cost. It's good, but it's an affront to a mindset that says we run the show. And so starting 10 years ago, the United States got it in its head that we got to stop this. It's crazy. How can you stop another country from achieving development. And how can you stop a country, 1.4 billion people? But the United States does genius things. Like I said, the genius thing of saying, President Maduro's not president, it's the one we chose. It's nuts. Okay, so what did President Obama decide to do? He said, we're going to have a trade agreement with Asia that will not include China. Well, duh. China's the largest trade partner of half the world, and it's the largest trading economy in Asia by far. And the United States, in its absolute foolishness, even explicitly says we need to make arrangements where we set the rules, the so-called rule-based order. Well, two things wrong with this. One, you can't have a trade arrangement in Asia without China. Are you kidding? And second, we were supposed to make international rules at the World Trade Organization. That was the idea of it. But that means actually that China has a voice. And so this is where we are right now. We are a declining hegemonic power in the United States, which has lost its nerve, which is fighting. It thought it was kind of a walk, at least into Ukraine, with NATO and, a destroyed Russia. That was their idea. Turned out to be a little bit naive, to say the least. An ascendant China, a BRICS group larger than the U.S.-backed G7 group, and there is no hegemon anymore. But the U.S. fights a rear guard on this, and the mentality is unbelievably weird and out of date. Okay, Biden lives in the past, literally, maybe even more than we realize. But in any event, all his tropes, which you guys talk about and I talk about, of the indispensable nation and U.S. leadership, well, those are so outdated that they were even funny in the 1990s. But kind of believable because the Soviet Union had disappeared suddenly in December 1991. But weird to hear now. The U.S. is the indispensable country. Sorry, not quite. The fight in Ukraine is really the last battle of the expanding empire. I call it the Teutoburg Forest battle. That was when the Roman Empire faced its limit finally on the Rhine, because Augustus in 9 AD wanted to keep expanding, and the Germans beat him on the Rhine. So Rome never conquered Germania. By the way, Rome remained an empire for centuries, so it wasn't the end of the world not to have Roman legions in Germania, and it will not be the end of the United States not to have NATO forces in Ukraine. But they think it is right now. So what we're seeing is a psyche that's wounded, that is still believing we run things, that still so much wants to run things. We get, I assume you get your monthly copy of Foreign Affairs magazine. All it is, every issue, is to try to cheer up the Americans that you're still number one. Every article is China in decline. Are we still the strongest? It's not even a scorecard that makes sense in a world of cooperation and economics. But to these strategists that rank everything, this is their world. So we've gone to protectionism. We ignore the World Trade Organization. We break every international agreement. We're on the veto side of every UN Security Council resolution. We're on the defeated side of almost every UN General Assembly resolution. What kind of hegemon is that? It is a country that was in the lead, that doesn't offer to other countries anymore, only threatens them. And you can't sustain your power only by threat. Anyway, the power doesn't even, it's evanescent in that sense when other countries have the same technologies you do. When we see that the NATO weaponry is no wonder weapons that defeats Putin from one day to the next, that Russia's very clever. They've got very sophisticated technologies. So this is why the whole idea of the hegemonic power is passé. But if you don't know it, it's really dangerous. And the U.S. doesn't recognize it yet. It hasn't changed its foreign policy appropriately.
Professor Sachs, I was wondering if we could go back to the Middle East, because the Middle East is such an enigmatic region. I mean, we've had so many wars there. There's also, I think, a widespread view that it has never fulfilled its economic promise since the Second World War. And yet one senses that things are starting to change now. We see Saudi Arabia and Iran making friends, and you've pointed out how neighbors being friends is economically beneficial. We see very ambitious economic development plans in Saudi Arabia itself. We see Saudi Arabia and the Emirates joining BRICS. We see Egypt joining BRICS, and Egypt is now also taking steps to seek industrialization. It's opening an industry park with Russia. It's got many contacts with China, all of these things. And one also gets the sense that lots of young people in the Middle East, increasingly well educated, they've got tremendous entrepreneurial flair. You see that in London, where we have a lot of people from the Middle East here. So do you sense that it's all finally coming together, that things are changing, that the Arab states are starting to think for themselves at last, rather than take their cue from Washington and London, Paris, and those sorts of places? I mean, you're in the Middle East now. So.
Yeah, I'm in Dubai in the Emirates. Mm-hmm. It is, I think it's fair to say, an extraordinarily complex region. It is fair to say it really has been an extraordinarily complex region for as long as we have history, because it really is, and it's the place where history was invented, after all. I think Herodotus's The Histories, which tells the war of the Persians versus the Greeks, gives us a flavor of things that went on for a very long time afterwards. So the Middle East is in the middle. It's in the middle of lots of different cultures, the Turkish world, the Arab world, the African world, the Western world, which became the imperial powers centuries ago, the Russian world. So it's an extremely complex region. It's, of course, in the world of the three great monotheistic religions, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. It is divided between the oil haves and the oil have-nots. It is the region probably that was, in a way, it's a little strange to say, but I'm going to say it, kind of the epicenter of European imperialism. Of course, Europe imperialized Africa, it imperialized India, Southeast Asia, but the Middle East was viewed so strategically. The Suez Canal, Britain's transport link to the jewel of the British Empire to India. And then in the 20th century, when Churchill converted the British Navy from coal to oil, suddenly the oil of the Middle East was strategically absolutely central, and it has basically remained almost that way until very, very recently. So you add it all up, it's been, what's said about the Versailles Treaty, that it was the peace to end all peace. It created so many more wars. But one thing it did was put Britain and France after 1919 into the center of imperialism for another grand war, after which the United States became the great Western imperial power. It created Israel, which has been the source of repeated war and endless turmoil, starting it as a British project in the British mandate after World War I. So to say that they've turned the corner on conflict would be premature, because this is a region not only with internal divisions, but with so much mischief coming from the outside. And we have the American fleet, in the Persian Gulf again, in the Eastern Mediterranean again. This is a playground of great powers that have created such a mess over the past century, but really centuries, that you can't declare that this is solved. But I think the key always in these circumstances is to understand it could be solved. There's nothing fundamental that prevents solutions. And I'll give you 3 exhibits to that. One is the Saudi-Iranian rapprochement, the Sunni-Shia rapprochement. Oh, you listen to any lecture at Harvard, they would have told you completely impossible. Any think tank in London or the United States, completely impossible. China pulled it off. Because what was impossible? To my mind, I recently went from Tehran to Riyadh. The problems are so shared. I wanted them to work together. At the time, it was impossible, but now it's possible. So this is one point of showing how this resolution can occur. Today, or I think it was yesterday, but the news today, who shows up in Greece? Erdogan. Erdogan goes to meet his Greek counterpart. Wonderful. The Greeks and the Turks have been at each other's necks basically since the Greek War of Independence that you know very well, of the 1820s. And Erdogan shows up. Phenomenal. I love Greece. I love Turkey. I love going to both. And I think the rapprochement, if it is that, would be phenomenally smart for both countries and both centers of civilization, after all. There's such an amazing fit. And I was going to give a third point. Now, this is actually absolutely crucial because we have an ongoing genocide taking place in Gaza right now. Israel is mass killing Gazans with the most vulgar, disgusting statements of intent coming from the Israeli political leaders. It's absolutely criminal in the literal international law sense what's going on. But what do the Arab leaders say, and what did the Arab Islamic leaders say when they met recently in Riyadh? They said, we could have peace with Israel, actually straightforwardly. Establish a state of Palestine according to all the UN Security Council resolutions, and Palestine and Israel live side by side in peace, and then we normalize our relations with Israel. Is that crazy to believe? No, it's absolutely possible. What stops it? Zealots. On the Israeli side, the zealots who are well represented in this terrible right-wing government of Netanyahu that believe in what they call Greater Israel, which means no Palestinian state nearby, in Palestinian land, by the way, despite resolutions of the UN Security Council that go back to Resolution 242 in 1967. So you really could have Israel in peace. You could have the region in peace between the Sunnis and the Shias, between Turkey and Greece. The West could actually behave itself for the first time in a century and not be so mischievous in the region. And you could actually see this region as a region with of course, as you say, tremendous talent, young people, gobs of money, because they have the largest sovereign wealth funds, and the Saudis are trying to build cutting edge technologies, the largest solar fields in the world. They want to shift out of hydrocarbons if there's a way to do it peacefully, cooperatively. And so we have all the reason to help make this work. But remember, the United States absolutely did so much damage to this by taking Arab nationalism and considering it the great threat and aiming to break it. Nasser could have been a partner with the world and with the West in modernization going back to the 1950s. The United States had the idea in its hegemonic worldview that any legitimate, popular government that is not under our thumb is a potential partner of the Soviet Union. So we can only abide by puppet regimes. This was the real mentality. So Nasser becomes an enemy. They made him an enemy. And this broke Arab nationalism. And it was a goal of the United States, divide et impera, divide and conquer, learn from the British very well. And it prevented this region from getting together. And so you ask, could it? Of course it could. Should it? My God, no question. We're not far from it, but instead we're in a horrific war, and the United States playing, as always, not just the spoiler, by the way, but the complete enabler. Every bomb, maybe not every bomb, but just about every bomb falling on Gaza is an American-made bomb. And this is shocking, disgusting, and a part of the reason why the region doesn't get out of this mess.
John Kirby actually gave a speech yesterday when he argued that no other country has done more to alleviate the suffering from Gazans than the United States. So it was quite a remarkable statement. But I want to suggest that perhaps that the problem is alliance systems, because classical realists since Morgenthau always argued that peacetime alliances is really a source of huge instability, because we see if you have a military power like the United States trying to organize a region, you would always have the incentives, again, in imperial logic of divide and conquer. So you see in all continents of the world, if you have a conflict with China, for example, whenever there's division between China and India, this is a benefit because you can weaken the Chinese and the Indians will become more reliant on the Americans. You've seen that now in Europe as well. As soon as we had this war now with the Russians, Europe is completely now subordinated to the United States. Meanwhile, the Russians, at least the objective was to weaken Russia. But we also see the same logic in the Middle East, of course. The more conflict you have between the Arabs and the Iranians, the more loyal the Arabs will be to America, and the more you can weaken the Iranians. But with the Chinese, given that they're not really a military power in the same sense, and they don't have any peacetime alliances, formal alliances, there seems to be more of a different systemic incentives from pursuing economic connectivity, because when the Chinese enter the Arab states, they're very careful also to reach out to the Iranians. So doing the exact opposite, make sure you don't pit them against each other, because then China would have to choose. And I thought the same now with Putin going down to Middle East. He goes to Saudi Arabia, UAE, and at the same time, he books an appointment with the Iranian president to come to Moscow just to make sure, we're not forming alliances here. Like we don't want to choose one and the cost will be to alienate the other. So would you contrast this economic connectivity of organizing a region versus the militarized alliance system? Or how would you, why is China so different in this region, for example, from the United States?
So, there are maybe four theories of international relations that are debated, or we in the West debate three, but I'm going to add a fourth. So our dear friend John Mearsheimer, who's really a wonderful person and a great political scientist, has the theory that he calls offensive realism, which is that states compete. It's a dangerous world out there. Everybody senses danger. It's a fight for survival, and therefore you're constantly pushing against the others, and you're constantly yearning for hegemony. Because being the hegemon is the only safe place in the world, after all. So you're always greatly endangered. And that's a world of conflict. And John Mearsheimer's most famous book is called The Tragedy of Great Power Politics. And he says it's a tragedy. And I say, John, you can't write a book that just ends in tragedy. You have to give a solution. And he says, Jeff, it's a tragedy. And I say, no, you can't accept a tragedy, because especially in a nuclear age, we can't accept that. We're going to blow ourselves to smithereens on your theory. Jeff, it's a tragedy. Okay, that's my ongoing debate with my dear friend John Mearsheimer. Then there's a theory that I would ascribe to the recently deceased Henry Kissinger, which is balance of power. That you don't need endless struggle. You need to create and structure a balance. The balance can be alliances, but it's better if it's a kind of concert of Europe where the major powers agree, don't push too hard against each other. And this is why Kissinger was rightly, wisely, among the big poobahs of foreign policy against NATO enlargement to Ukraine. Actually, I would say all experienced diplomats was a bunch of foolish politicians like Biden and others that push for it. But Kissinger says, don't rock the boat, make a concert of big powers. And of course, his model was the concert of Europe after the defeat of Napoleon in 1815, and the structuring together of a system in Europe in which the major powers preserved the peace under Metternich and then later under Bismarck. There were some skirmishes in Europe, more than skirmishes, German reunification, Italian reunification, the Crimean War, which was an imperialist war by Britain and France against Russia. But by and large, the 19th century didn't have a world war between the Napoleonic Wars and World War I. So that was the balance of power theory that Kissinger tried to put into play. The interesting thing about balance of power, though, is that it becomes imbalanced because if you had a static substrate of relative economic size and technology, you probably could fashion a predictable geopolitical and military equilibrium, but power changes. And it was, of course, the rise of Germany that changed the balance of power in Europe at the end of the 19th century. And this is absolutely important to understand. To keep the balance of power in Europe required tremendous prudence and wisdom, and Bismarck had that. Bismarck was a geopolitical genius, and he was thrown out when the old Kaiser died and the young kid came in, and the young kid got it into his head that he was going to compete with Britain for naval supremacy. And Bismarck said, why will we do that? Bismarck was dismissed. And there was the end of the balance of power because it required genius to hold it together. And the Kaiser Wilhelm II, famously said to Bismarck, what are we going to do if the British show up on our shores? And Bismarck famously said, well, Kaiser, we'll have them arrested. In other words, we don't need to build a world-class navy. We just need to, bide our own time. Things will be fine. But Wilhelm II didn't believe it, got into an arms race with Britain, alliances, and all the rest, and eventually World War I broke out. So that's the second theory. My theory is, why don't we all get along? That's my theory. I'm an economist. I learned from Adam Smith that a world market is better than protected national markets, that global trade is better than mercantilism, and kind of from Immanuel Kant in his famous essay on perpetual peace in 1795, that actually a set of republics that trade with each other and act peacefully with each other is the kind of world that we want. Now, I devote my life to that. I work with the UN on countless matters and donate my time to the UN because I believe we could fashion an international framework of law in which countries could grow, in which China's success would not be viewed or acted upon as a threat by the United States, because it's no such thing at all, in which the United States could not unilaterally sanction Russia or grab foreign exchange reserves because it's against international law, which, by the way, it is against international law, which the U.S. happens to completely ignore. So my theory is that cooperation is so important that we could actually find our way to achieve it. It's a long story, but it's not impossible to cooperate. Of course, there are cheaters that try to take advantage of softies and so forth and abuse of privileges. But we really could have an international system of law. The United States is the least multilateral country among all major economies. I've just done a study looking at the number of times the U.S. violates international law, basically, and it's the most of any country because it's all unilateralism. That's being, the would-be hegemonic power, not abiding by the views of the rest of the international system. But that's what I would aim for, and I don't think it's naive. I think it's vital for survival, especially because we have to grapple with mass environmental crises and horrible depletion of our oceans and pollution and many other things that we need to deal with together through a cooperative approach. Now, I said there's a fourth approach. This is arguable, but I think Chinese statecraft really is different. And it's fascinating to me. And I've just been reading some Chinese philosophers who say, we really think about the world order in a different way, in a truly Confucian way. Confucius's the greatest virtue for Confucius was orderliness, was harmony. You hear that word repeatedly. It's really a Chinese, very deep idea. And China is very different from Europe, which created our international system, because in Europe, the Roman Empire fell in 476 AD, and it never came together again. Europe remained fragmented after the fall of the Western Roman Empire until today. And you could say the European Union is the attempt to put something unified together. China has a completely different history. China unified in 221 BC, and by and large, with episodes of breakdown that lasted decades, not centuries, China has remained a unified state. So China went through the Han Dynasty and the Tang and Song and Yuan and Ming and Qing, but as a unified state. So China doesn't have that sense of fragmentation the same way. Of course, it always faced invaders from the north, the nomadic invaders, but this is quite different, and internal rebellions. But China has the idea, we're unified. Our western border is the Himalayas. Okay, our southern border is the tropical rainforest border. Our eastern border is the Great Ocean. Our northern border is the steppe region, the dryland region. Yes, we keep getting some invasions across that way, but we are a unified state, and our statecraft is that we want unity across the Indian Ocean, across the South China Sea. China never invaded Japan once, not even once in 2,000 years, except when China was ruled briefly by the Mongols, and the Mongols tried 2 failed invasions, defeated each time by a typhoon, which became called the kamikaze winds. But the point I'm making is that in the West, it's fighting all the time. How many years were France and Britain at war across the English Channel. Well, most of a millennium. And compare that with China and Japan. No wars. And 2 invasions, I think it's 1274 and 1281, if I remember correctly, but I may have the decade off by 1 decade. And then at the end of the 16th century, a kind of crazy shogun of Japan decided that he would invade China. He ended up getting defeated in the Korean Peninsula. But other than that, the two didn't fight. And here's what's fascinating. At the end of the 19th century, Japan industrialized first. And then Japan, starting after it had its so-called Meiji Restoration in 1868, it went into hypercharged industrialization, absolutely remarkable. And all subsequent East Asian miracles really follow the Meiji Restoration model. But without digressing, at the end of the 19th century, Japan was the single industrial power of Asia, and Japan literally self-consciously said, okay, we have joined the European club. Now we can be an imperial power. So Japan launches the Sino-Japanese War, or the Japanese-Sino War of 1895. That's when it gains control of Taiwan as a colony and its first control over the Korean Peninsula, which would come a little bit later as a full colony. And the Chinese are dumbfounded by this. You know, the top diplomats of the Japanese and the Chinese were friends. And the Chinese actually plaintively look at the Japanese saying, what are you doing? You know, the Europeans are coming to attack us, and you're behaving like them. And the Japanese say, oh, so sorry. Yes, we are Japanese, but now we're part of their club. And so the Japanese become European imperialists, European style imperialists, I should say, just to be clear. And the Chinese never became that in their history. China never made overseas transoceanic empires. You could argue, okay, it expanded its landmass up to the steppe region, up to the Himalayas, down to the tropical rainforest, to the East Coast. But basically, beyond that, it never tried to conquer overseas colonies. It never had them. So the argument of this fourth approach is that China really thinks differently about geopolitics. John Mearsheimer, our dear friend, would say, no. This is structural. China will become like the United States. It will compete for hegemonic status. But look at what China says every day. If you go to the Chinese Foreign Ministry website, almost every week there's some brilliant, ingenious report, including about American hegemony, including about China's development initiative, its global strategic initiative, its global civilizations initiative, and so forth. China says no hegemony. We don't want hegemony. We want harmony. We want to live under the UN Charter. And the United States says, oh, that's, they want to take us over. And China says, no, we don't want that. We just want harmony. We can't imagine another country behaving in a non-European imperial way. But I think it's actually true. Unless we so damn provoke China into terrible behavior, China absolutely, in my opinion, wants cooperation. And we should meet it there and cooperate in that way.
I mean, I'm not a China expert at all, but I used to read a lot of Chinese philosophy and some literature, and I agree. One of the interesting things about Chinese literature and Chinese painting, in which, by the way, I have a great fondness for Chinese painting, is that depictions of war are absent from it. It's all about harmony, and it is all about peace. It's one of the things that attracts me to it.
Yeah, this is so true. What a great observation. I've never made it or heard it, but it's absolutely true. You don't see war pictures and conquest pictures. I just was in Chinese museums recently, and it's absolutely correct what you say. And I never thought about it, but it's absolutely true.